It's about the show. It's about what they say and not what they do. And if there was one group that I would hope would hold people more accountable for what they actually do as opposed to what they say, it would be people who have served. Hey, shout out to all of our subscribers and members here on the channel. My name is Reese Waters, and I'm troubled.
James Diaz started his job at the IRS office in Galesburg last April. First as a tax advisory specialist, then a few months later as a fuel compliance officer, a move he took as a promotion with a pay raise.
This right here is my termination letter.
A week ago today, Diaz was fired, receiving a letter from the Federal Office of Personnel Management.
Here's where it comes. Taking into account your performance and in light of mission needs, the agency finds that your continued employment at this agency is not in the public interest.
Diaz is a combat veteran. He served in the Army during the first Gulf War. After working as a truck driver and in manufacturing factories, he got his college degree in 2020.
I am upset, mad, and just confused at how they could treat people who put their life on the line for the country, who put themselves in harm's way, can be treated like this.
He says his OMP letter implies he was underperforming, something he calls a lie.
This was my first boss's narrative on my performance.
Diaz showed us his performance reviews.
You consistently take steps to identify and avoid work delays. You attempt to use your time in an efficient manner, whether waiting on customers, researching, or other duties assigned. You keep yourself constantly busy with productive work. Absolutely directly contradicts what I've got in that OPM letter.
He took pride working for the federal government. Now, as he's left to find a new job, all he feels is frustration.
I voted for Trump, but I still support, a lot of his policies. But I don't necessarily support the method that he's implementing them.
Yet, according to a Pew poll shortly before the 2024 election, 60% of the 16 million Americans who have served in the military supported Donald Trump, and 55% believed his policies would make things better for veterans. Now, this is something that I need to try and understand, because Donald Trump did not ever run against a veteran or somebody who had served in the military. So you don't have that direct connection. It's not like, the police voting against an attorney general or anything like that. But one thing we do know is he got 5 deferments from the military. And we also understand this narrative of poor people and disenfranchised communities fighting rich people's wars. So he got a whole pass on that. And then you have the reports of him calling veterans stupid and not understanding their sacrifice when he went over to Europe.
Tonight, for the first time, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, is responding to shocking comments posted online by Donald Trump. The former president suggested last Friday that the nation's highest-ranking military officer deserves to be executed for communications the general had with China during the final months of the Trump administration. President Trump recently said that your dealings with China were so egregious that in times gone by, the punishment would have been death.
That's right, he said that. Mm-hmm. That's correct.
He is suggesting that you be punished by death. The former commander-in-chief to his former top military advisor.
Look, I'm a soldier. I've been faithful and loyal to the Constitution of the United States for 44 and a half years. And my family and I have sacrificed greatly for this country, my mother and father before them. And, as much as these comments are directed at me, it's also directed at the institution of the military. And there's 2.1 million of us in uniform. And the American people can take it to the bank that all of us, every single one of us, from private to general, we're loyal to that Constitution and we'll never turn our back on it no matter what the threats, no matter what the humiliation, no matter what. If we're willing to die for that document, if we're willing to deploy to combat, if we're willing to lose an arm, a leg, an eye, to protect and support and defend that document and protect the American people, then we're willing to live for it too.
There is his lack of understanding of American histories. You remember the defending the airports in the Revolutionary War?
Our Army manned the airports. It ran the ramparts. It took over the airports. It did everything it had to do. And at Fort McHenry, under the rocket's red glare, it had nothing but victory. And when dawn came, their star-spangled banner waved defiant.
We have him reportedly calling veterans suckers and losers, which was another thing that came out before the election.
At the time, it seemed odd. The President of the United States skipping a ceremony to honor Americans killed in the First World War, blaming the weather, even though other officials made it. The Atlantic magazine reports that on that specific visit, Donald Trump told staff, "Why should I go to that cemetery? It's filled with losers." Later, he called 1,800 Americans who died in the legendary Battle of Belleau Wood suckers for getting killed. The reporter behind the story stands by it and his high-level, unnamed sources.
He doesn't understand why one would go pay that level of respect to fallen American soldiers.
And if you choose not to believe suckers and losers or calling them stupid because you didn't see it come out of his mouth, one thing you know came out of his mouth was what he said about John McCain.
He hit me. He's not a war hero. He's a war hero. He's a war hero.
5.5 years.
He's a war hero because he was captured. I like people that weren't captured, okay? I hate to tell you.
And that is in addition to what we saw at Arlington Cemetery, where if you wanted to give him a pass for shooting campaign footage inside restricted areas of the cemetery, if you want to give him a pass for that, at the very minimum, you would think a decent, respectful American would fall back when they're notified of the infraction. Is that what happened? Is that how that was handled?
The video was used for a campaign post on TikTok. A big no-no.
We didn't lose one person in 18 months. And then they took over that disaster, the leaving of Afghanistan.
The Army is also coming to the defense of a woman cemetery employee who they say was abruptly pushed aside while blocking Trump's team from filming. But Trump's campaign spokesman claims the worker was suffering from a mental health episode and denies there was any pushing.
Now, I'm not going to come with the usual FAFO energy that I've had on a lot of these videos because I am very grateful to your service and I don't know the mindset that you would be in because I have never served. So I will put it as a question to you and as a question to those who are watching. How? I just laid out. I just need to know how. 60% of the 16 million Americans who have served in the military supported Donald Trump, and 55% believed his policies would make things better for veterans. Have they? Consider the wrenching stories emerging from the massive haphazard cuts that Trump and Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency are making to the federal workforce. There's the retired Navy captain and high-ranking official at FEMA who accepted Doge's buyout offer, only to be later fired anyway.
Scott, correct me if I'm wrong, a couple days ago, you were fired without getting the deferred resignation offer. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's all correct. And on the 4th of February, I did the requisite resign reply, and the next day received an acknowledgement. We've received your email. We'll be in touch shortly. Then I didn't hear anything until the 18th of February when I received a termination letter. And, that had some interesting verbiage in there regarding the deferred resignation program, which I'm happy to share with you. But yeah, it was a little, I won't say I was surprised. I guess I was more disappointed that, right. The trust that I showed in the process and the offer, ultimately the rug was yanked out from under me.
The security specialist at the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, whose termination letter emphasized his probationary status, even though he's a medically retired veteran with multiple years of service at the Department of Defense. The disabled Army veteran who served 2 tours in Iraq and 2 in Afghanistan, who was fired from his job in public affairs at Veterans Affairs, and so many more. As one disabled veteran who voted for Trump and was fired last week put it, we didn't think they were going to take a chainsaw to a silk rug. Now, you may not have known that, but one thing that you definitely knew was that DEI was something that actively looks to protect veterans in circumstances like these, and they made that a top priority of the administration. That's one thing that you did know.
Is not affirmative action as some might think. DEI is about making sure that, say, a veteran may have a handicap, an injury from the services, and come to work for the federal government. DEI would make sure that that veteran has the I guess I would say the opportunity to work in a job, and they would place them in a position where they could accommodate that veteran and so that they can do their job. So DEI is about that and about providing services for workers. It's not about the color of a person's skin.
And it's not a quota program. Let's just be clear. It means that, and it also, I think, for a lot of conservatives, they believe DEI just means black people getting jobs. And so when they see a black person in any job, they say, oh, that person's a DEIer. They said it about the literal elected vice president of the United States.
Absolutely.
She wasn't hired. She was hired by the American people. 80 million Americans voted for her, but they can't see through her race and gender. So it isn't just about hiring black people and women, right? It's about disabled veterans being accommodated. It's veterans returning from wars are also under DEI.
Absolutely. And I see that as a veteran myself, right? I see this initiative as a direct impact and attack on veterans. Of the 2.2 million federal workers, 642,000 of those are veterans. And so this is, in my way of viewing this, is a direct attack against veterans as well.
These wholesale cuts, which ultimately could target more than 300,000 federal workers, have fallen disproportionately on veterans because the government is by far the largest employer of veterans in America. They comprise 28% of the federal workforce versus 5% in the private sector. House Democrats estimate that nearly 6,000 veterans have lost their jobs already. A back-of-the-envelope calculation based on the cuts so far and those currently planned finds that as many as 100,000 veterans will be out of work when it's all said and done. And it's at that point we have to mention, while we weren't aware of just how wanton and wide-ranging the cuts that Elon Musk would attempt to institute in our federal government would be and how quickly they would be instituted. But we did know that that was going to be his role. And we also knew how vulnerable veterans would be in a circumstance like that because of how large of the federal workforce they comprise. That's another thing that we definitely knew before the election. Around 36% of veterans in the civil service are disabled or have serious health conditions, so roughly 36,000 disabled veterans will be added to the unemployment rolls, where they are certain to face much more difficulty in landing a private sector job than others fired in the purge. Many will no doubt spiral. The question then becomes whether there will still be sufficient government services to help them. After all, more than 2,500 Veterans Affairs employees have been fired, including staff critical to the functioning of the Veterans Crisis Line.
In recent weeks, thousands of workers at Veterans Affairs medical centers around the country have lost their jobs, and that includes dozens here in West Michigan. It all stems from President Trump's efforts to reduce federal government spending and make agencies like the VA more efficient, effective, and responsive to the American public.
They have a lot of anxiety. They have a lot of fear. They don't know if they're going to come in today and lose their job tomorrow.
At the Battle Creek VA Medical Center, nearly 10 employees have been let go by the Department of Veteran Affairs in a matter of weeks. Nationally, that number has climbed to 2,400.
I represent all the members, and if we lose one member, that's one member too many that we've lost.
A 24/7 toll-free hotline that's been instrumental in mitigating the catastrophic suicide rates among veterans. To the members of Congress who voted to send U.S. troops to war, the generals who led the campaigns, the presidents of both parties who gave the orders, and the citizens who voted for them, who will be responsible when a veteran calls the VA crisis line and nobody answers.
You know, we saw just yesterday another round of layoffs at the VA. I serve on the House Veterans Affairs Committee, 1,400 more people to be laid off. And what I'm thinking about on that committee is when we're trying to address veteran suicide rates, when you're cutting jobs from folks that are actually answering those suicide hotlines, how is that in the service of our veterans?
And not an agency that's ever been accused of being overstaffed or overfunded.
It is understaffed, actually.
Rich Vogt, the architect of Project 2025, is now the director of the Office of Management and Budget, where he has partnered with Musk in the mass firings of federal workers. Last year, he said, quote, "We want the bureaucrats to be traumatically affected. When they wake up in the morning, we want them to not want to go to work because they are increasingly viewed as the villains. We want their funding to be shut down so that the EPA can't do all the rules against our energy industry because they have no bandwidth financially to do so. We want to put them in trauma." And he said this about a workforce with a disproportionately large amount of veterans. The trauma that these cuts will cause is even more devastating than Vought could imagine. The Doge purge will affect every corner of the country, devastating military veteran communities like Huntsville, Alabama, and Colorado Springs, Colorado. As the country is driven into recession, veterans will face chronic unemployment and the ripple effects of poverty, homelessness, the epidemic of self-medication, and suicide. Whatever pittance these federal cuts will save will pale in comparison to the costs, literal and figurative, of the misery it will cause. Misery just like this. Quote, "We just received an email at the Seattle VA. They are reducing the balance of all procurement cards to $1. That means we can't buy supplies for the hospital. We can't buy gas for shuttles or for social workers to do home visits. We can't pay for beneficiary travel for veterans. We can't pay for lodging for transplant patients." This came from GSA, but it really came from Doge. Our facility got notice only today, even though the GSA memo is from 2/20. This will cripple patient care at the VA. Trauma like this. A Navy vet was given weeks to live in 2020. Now his cancer treatment is at risk. Navy veteran Kyle Lewis, who was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer in 2020, says federal research cuts means he can no longer access his experimental cancer treatment. In the wake of cuts to federal research funding, a Navy veteran diagnosed with stage 4 cancer will not be able to receive an experimental treatment he says extended his life after doctors gave him weeks to live in 2020. And if it wasn't bad enough to cut the existing benefits and availability of medical care, they're actively making it worse in the future. VA research on cancer, suicide prevention, toxic exposure at risk from federal hiring freeze. Hundreds of Department of Veteran Affairs medical research projects are being threatened by a hiring freeze across the federal government. A pair of top Democratic senators warned in a letter to the department this week. About 200 research personnel could be cut, and an estimated 370 studies and clinical trials could be canceled or suspended in the next 90 days if the freeze isn't lifted, the senator said, directly impacting up to 10,000 veterans currently participating in research studies. Studies on cancer treatments, opioid addiction, prosthetics, suicide prevention, and toxic exposures are among those at risk, a coalition of research organizations warned in its own letter to Congress last week.
The Department of Veterans Affairs has rehired roughly a dozen people who worked on the Veterans Crisis Hotline after the department fired about 1,000 workers last week. Now, you think that these 11 or 12 workers were targeted because of their probationary status, even though they'd been in their jobs for a while, but because of their hiring preference given to veterans. Is that what happened? Did you get any answers earlier today when you asked about this?
We're still waiting our way through it. I do know that what happens a lot is that federal government, one agency will hire a veteran from a different agency using veterans preference because they can then hire them on. Basically, they're shifting from one federal job to another federal job, and so then they get labeled as probationary. But at least about a dozen that I know of personally that they were being reinstated. But as of this morning, they have not regained access to their employee portals yet. And remember that these are the folks who are answering the crisis hotline that veterans who are contemplating suicide call.
And then we get this. Trump administration plans to cut 80,000 employees from Veterans Affairs, according to internal memo. The Department of Veterans Affairs is planning a reorganization that includes cutting over 80,000 jobs from the sprawling agency that provides health care and other services for millions of veterans, according to an internal memo obtained by the Associated Press. The VA's Chief of Staff, Christopher Cyrek, told top-level officials at the agency Tuesday that it had an objective to cut enough employees to return to 2019 staffing levels of just under 400,000. That would require terminating tens of thousands of employees after the VA expanded during the Biden administration, as well as to cover veterans impacted by burn pits under the 2022 PACT Act. The memo instructs top-level staff to prepare an agency-wide reorganization in August to resize and tailor the workforce to the mission and revised structure. It also calls for agency officials to work with the White House's Department of Government Efficiency to move out aggressively while taking a pragmatic and disciplined approach to the Trump administration's goals, government executive first reported on the internal memo. And what exactly is the party line? What are they saying when pressed with the current state of veterans in America?
Starting to think about maybe some of those veterans who worked for the federal government and maybe what the administration can do to at least help salvage their lives.
Well, as you know, we care about veterans tremendously. I mean, that's something the president has always cared about. Anybody in blue, anybody that serves this country. But at the same time, we have taxpayer dollars. We have a fiscal responsibility to use taxpayer dollars to pay people that actually work. That doesn't mean that we forget our veterans by any means. We are going to care for them in the right way, but perhaps they're not fit to have a job at this moment or not willing to come to work.
Now, I want you to listen to that statement one more time.
Well, as you know, we care about veterans tremendously. I mean, that's something the president has always cared about. Anybody in blue, anybody that serves this country. But at the same time, we have taxpayer dollars. We have a fiscal responsibility to use taxpayer dollars to pay people that actually work. That doesn't mean that we forget our veterans by any means. We are going to care for them in the right way, but perhaps they're not fit to have a job at this moment or not willing to come to work.
That was such a perfect encapsulation of MAGA-ism. In the same 30-second clip, she said, we care about our veterans. We wouldn't forget about anybody, she said in blue, but in uniform. We wouldn't forget about anybody in uniform. We're going to care for them in the right way. She also said, perhaps they're not fit to have a job right now. She also said we have a fiscal responsibility to pay people who actually want to come to work. Just completely blindly connecting veterans with people who don't want to come to work and promise absolutely nothing when it comes to addressing how veterans have been impacted by all of this. She gave you absolutely nothing. In fact, she insinuated that these are lazy people who don't want to come to work and they have a fiscal responsibility to cut the fat and maybe they're not fit to have a job. She actually made a bunch of negative connections in the midst of saying, oh, we care about our veterans. We're going to take care of them in the right way. That is such a perfect encapsulation of MAGA, because this is the same group that will bring up a young boy who is battling cancer during an address to Congress by Trump while actively cutting research for child cancer. We'll make a connection about elevated cancer risk and exposure to chemicals while cutting funding for the EPA. This is the same group that had Black MAGA up shucking and jiving at the White House for Black History Month and fired the chair of the Joint Chiefs and cut a HBCU land grant scholarship program before people had even gotten their Ubers home.
She's going to be my pardon czar, okay?
She has been just so outstanding, and I'm so proud of you. And we're giving Alice a full pardon. You can do whatever you want in life, and just keep doing the great job you're doing.
You know, Alice was in prison for doing something that today probably wouldn't even be prosecuted. You've been an inspiration to people. And we're going to be listening to your recommendation on pardons. You're going to go over and she's going to be my pardon czar, okay? And you're going to find people just like you that should not have happened.
Meanwhile, this is Clay Kane. According to the New York Times, the Justice Department has halted new civil rights investigations and signaled it may backtrack on Biden-era agreements with police departments accused of discrimination or violence. In two internal memos, the department's chief of staff ordered a freeze on civil rights litigation and consent decrees, requiring senior Trump appointees' approval for new cases or interventions.
It's about the show. It's about what they say and not what they do. And if there was one group that I would hope would hold people more accountable for what they actually do as opposed to what they say, it would be people who have served. I just need to understand how, at this point, eyes aren't open and it isn't readily apparent what they are about. I would have thought that would have been the case. I just don't know what it's going to take. It very much disturbs me to see the mistreatment of people who have served this country in military. As I've said many times, I come from a military family. I have a long line of relatives who have served in the military, and I think people who put their lives on the line to protect our freedom have done so, have entered into a contract that they will be taken care of. We've seen that not honored many times in the past, and there are things we bring up all the time, typically when it comes to black servicemen, decades ago. But this is what's happening right now. And what is odd to me is how disturbed I am by these things, all of these things, including what I mentioned at the outset, but apparently none of them were enough to open eyes to where he and they really stand when it comes to the military. This is about what they do. And we have seen it for a while with very little pushback. And that is why I'm troubled. Sincere thanks to all of the subscribers and the members that have supported this channel. We just hit a new milestone, and that is 2,000 members. So I want to give you a sincere thank you to everybody that's a part of that 2,000. And with that comes first a celebration of the 2,000, but also regular members' lives. Be on the lookout for a poll that I'm going to send out to you guys on when you guys would most want to have these lives, because I want to do it when the most people can attend. It's really about time that we can have, a semi-private conversation outside of the prying ears of the algorithm, which also means it can get colorful and go exactly where you want it to go.
What do you mean by that?
No, not that. No, I knew what you was thinking. I knew you was going to take it there.
And it is time for it to stop. And it stopped on Tuesday.
I'm also going to start bringing guests and collaborating with other creators on my regular Tuesday lives. So if you have somebody else in this space, or another creator, or a comedian, or maybe just a poli-sci major you think I could have a really good conversation with, go ahead and send your suggestions to admin@reesewaters.com. You could also submit it at the portal on my website. That's also where you could sign up for the newsletter and see all the newest merch that we're rolling out, some brand new stuff on the horizon. But I want to come back to where I started and thank you guys for making this channel so much more than I ever thought possible.